to come to Bangalore for a long time, and it's finally my opportunity. So I'm glad to be here. Okay, so what I wanted to look at is 3 general categories of strategies you can use for building Ajax applications. But first, I want to talk a little bit about why do you even want to do Ajax applications? Because basically, Ajax is a big, giant, kludgy hack. It's ugly and it's messy, and so why do you want to do that? And that's what I want to start with first, and then look at 3 general categories of approaches for building Ajax. Okay, so I used to have an office mate who built one of the first ever commercial web browsers called Mosaic. And when they first developed this, they were thinking of just viewing technical documents. This is a bunch of physicists who made this stuff. And HTML is lousy. I mean, it's fine for technical documents, but for real programs, HTML is crummy. And even if you spruce it up with Ajax, it's still not going to be as good as a real program. You know, if you sit down and you look at a real program, it looks kind of good. And you look at an Ajax-based application, and it looks kind of mediocre. And furthermore, HTTP is a lousy protocol for the way that we use web applications nowadays. So we've got bad GUIs, we've got tedious programming, and we've got a bad protocol. So why in the world do we want to do all this stuff? Why don't we just build a real program? But the answer to that is universal access. You don't always want this. If you don't want universal access, if you don't need somebody to be able to walk up to any random computer and access your application, build a regular program. Don't build a web app. But the reason you want web apps is this. A number of months ago, I was in the Philippines. And when I was in the Philippines, I flew to an island called Palawan. And I went to this very tiny town called El Nido, which even people in the Philippines have not heard of. And I rented a motorbike. And I drive down this dirt road and across the countryside through the rice fields, and as far away from civilization as you can imagine. And I arrive in this little tiny town of maybe 50 people, and there's an internet cafe. Well, I can walk into that internet, park my motorbike, walk into the internet cafe, log into Gmail, and check my, or Yahoo Mail, and check my email. And both of those are Ajax-based applications. That's why you want web applications. If you don't need this kind of universal access from any random computer, any place, you can do a lot better. The second question is, well, okay, you want a web application. Why do I want to add Ajax on top of a web application, which is already hard enough to build? And Ajax tries to spruce up web applications and make them better. In particular, it tries to solve two problems that regular web applications have. First of all, in a traditional web application, you fill out a form, you press submit, and then you wait for the entire web page to come back. And so there's 2 problems with that. First of all, you have to get an entire web page back. You can't just get a little piece of data back. And secondly, you can't do anything in the meantime. After you press submit, you're just stuck until the page comes back. You can't do anything. You can't interact. You can't keep working in the meantime. And so Ajax tries to make that better. In particular, it tries to make finer-grained updates, and it tries to make it asynchronous, so you can keep working while you're waiting for some results. But the key to Ajax is it's what's the best you can do with what's already in the browser now. And what do browsers have? What technologies do browsers support? All right, HTML is one. What else? JavaScript, what else? CSS. That's it. That's all you've got. You've got HTML, you've got CSS, and you've got JavaScript. And that's not much to work with. And so, as I've said, you know, Ajax is kind of a layers of hacks on top of layers of hacks on top of layers of kludges, but it's the best you can do with what you've already got in a browser. If you don't need this, if you don't need to let people run in a browser with nothing installed, no plugins, nothing extra, then you can do better. Okay, and people have tried to put in real browser-based content. The most famous example is Java Applets. Now, a lot of the work that I do is in Java, and I'm happy about that Java Applets existed because they were kind of the kick that got Java started as a programming language. But basically, the guy that kicked the snowball down the hill died. And Java applets were basically a miserable failure. But for a while, they were popular, and they got Java going, and now Java's used for other things. But you get a browser now, it doesn't have Java installed. So this is not universal access. Flash is definitely a very serious player, but it's not exactly in the same ballpark. Flash requires a plugin. And Flash is mostly still nowadays used for video. There's some talks here about using it for other applications. But it's still not the same as Ajax. It's not what can you do with what's already in a browser right now. But this is certainly a serious competitor in the somewhat web-based rich applications. Silverlight is certainly trying to get into the game. You know, they've had their eye on Flash for a long time. And maybe I shouldn't say that they're new, but they aren't proven in the sense that Flash is proven in widely deployed applications. Oracle is trying to get back in the game with JavaFX. They've been working on that for a while, but it's still not the same thing because you need a download. You need a plugin. So in a regular web application, you fill out a form, you press submit, and you wait for a long time. And you get an entire new web page back, even if only one little tiny piece of the page has changed, and you can't do anything in the meantime. In an Ajax-based application, JavaScript fires off these little HTTP requests behind the scenes. You can keep working in the meantime, and then some data comes back, and it gets inserted into the page. So it's a smaller amount of data, and you can keep working in the meantime. And probably the example that we're all familiar with the most about this is the Google homepage. So if I go to the Google homepage and I type in my name, when I type in an M, pops the 10 most popular queries at Google that start with the letter M. And if I'm on a slow internet connection, I can keep typing ahead. I'm not frozen. And if it can't keep up for a while, then it catches up eventually, and I can keep going in the meantime. But when I type that M, JavaScript sent that M across the network to Google. A Java program answered. It talked to their indexing engine, which is mostly in C++. It sent the data back. It arrived back in JavaScript, and it stuck it into this drop-down box. And then you think about this, and you say, well, wait a second. There's no such thing as a drop-down box in HTML. So they had to make this out of HTML. A div with absolute positioning, and CSS styling, and maybe a UL list inside of here, and some CSS to light up the appropriate characters. And I type in a few more characters, M-A-R-T-H-A, and so on. And eventually, I get some results, and I suppose that perhaps has to do with me. But the point is that I'm getting small amounts of data, and it's asynchronous. If I type fast, and I'm on a slow network connection, I'm on a Wi-Fi access here, I'm not frozen in the meantime. And it's difficult to measure the market penetration of different technologies. But one of the ways that I try to measure the market penetration is look at keywords that appear in job postings. And there's a site based in the US, but it samples job sites from around the world called Indeed.com. And what I really like about it is that it shows graphs of job postings containing certain keywords over time. So here are job postings since 2005 that contain the word Java. Here are job postings in blue since 2005 that contain the word C# someplace in the job posting. Green is VB, black is PHP, and red is Ajax. And the point here is that if you believe Indeed.com statistics, it should be taken with some grains of salt because it depends on what job sites they sample. But there are now more job postings worldwide that contain the keyword Ajax than contain either VB or PHP. So it's mainstream technology, and it's growing rapidly. OK, so now, all right, we want to do Ajax. First of all, we want a web application. I taught a class at a client once, and I was going to teach 1 week on basic Java and 1 week on using Java to build web applications. And they were going to spend some weeks in between practicing. And in the first week, I kept emphasizing, now, make sure you really want to do web applications. And they said, well, we're doing a medical application. We're installing it in the doctor's offices. He can only access it from the computer in his office. And by about the 3rd day of my first course, they said, well, I guess we don't really need you to come back next week after all, because we're not going to do web applications. Sorry, you're fired. So I talked myself out of a job, but that's good. So first, you want web applications. Secondly, you want Ajax. So traditional web applications are not good enough. They're not interactive enough for you. You want Ajax. Now, what approach do you use for Ajax? And there's 3 general categories of approaches. Inside each of these categories, and you've got about 10 other options. And the first situation is you have a web app already, and you want to improve it by Ajaxifying it. And yes, Ajaxifying is a real word. Computer scientists in the US like to say all nouns can be verbed. So you want to Ajaxify an existing application. So you've already built it. You built it in PHP, you built it in .NET, you built it in Java, you built it in Ruby on Rails. But it was a traditional web application, and now you want to add Ajax on top of it. What do you do? And in that situation, the best approach is to grab one of the good JavaScript libraries. And there's a bunch of really good libraries out there. jQuery, EXTJS, Dojo, YUI, Prototype, Scriptaculous, Google Closure, Mootools, and there's a bunch of others. I'm sorry if I didn't mention your favorite one. But doing it in raw JavaScript and raw CSS is too hard. It's too hard to maintain. It's too low level. It's kludge enough even when you use these libraries. So you definitely want a library. But these libraries are best when you already have an application and you want to add Ajax functionality to that application. Now, then you got the question, well, OK, fine. I'm in category 1. I have an existing application. I want to add Ajax functionality to it. Which one of these libraries do I use? That's another hard question. I'm going to talk about that this afternoon. But just as a quick preview of this talk I'm going to give at 12:20, I'm not going to give you a definitive answer. It's a very difficult question, and it depends on a lot of considerations. OK, so let me give you a quick example of doing this with jQuery. jQuery is one of the libraries that I like best. Not necessarily the best for all applications, but one of the ones that I tend to like best. So I've already got an application. And it's a traditional web application, and it's for banking. So you go to a lot of the online banking applications in the US are built this way, often with Java on the back end, but for the purpose of Ajax, it usually doesn't matter what's on the back end. And so I want to log in, I want to enter my customer ID and my password, and I'm going to press submit, and I want to get the first name, the last name, and the bank account balance of the person who has that customer ID. And I originally built this as a traditional web application. So I made an HTML form. I made a submit button. It went to the server. The server looked up the information, talked to a database maybe, used some object relational mapping or something, produced an entire new web page, complete web page, and sent that back. And now I want to Ajaxify it. So with jQuery, I still make a form. But the form doesn't have a normal submit button. Instead, you make a push button, and you give this push button an ID. You don't even give it some explicit JavaScript functionality. And then, here's the beauty of jQuery. These 1, 2, 3, 4 lines of code, 5 lines of code, depending where I put the carriage returns, is all you need in jQuery to make a Ajax call to the server, get the data back, and insert the result into the page. So let me just, this is not supposed to be a jQuery tutorial, but let me just summarize this quickly. This line right here says, find the HTML element that has the ID customer button, which is right there. So this says, find the push button. And then this part in here says, attach this JavaScript function name as the click handler for the HTML element that has this ID. So that says, find this push button, and when you press it, call this JavaScript function. And here's that JavaScript function. This JavaScript function says, find the form that has this ID. So there's the ID right there. And build a query string the same way a browser would build a query string if you submitted a form normally. So find the names of the various different HTML elements and URL encode them and put ampersands and equal sign, all the stuff a browser would normally do, and just return that as a string. And then this line in red says, go to the server to this address, pass it this query data, take the result that comes back, and stick it into the page in the place that has this ID. All right, here's a trick question for you. What does the acronym AJAX stand for? Okay, before you answer that question, let me ask you another trick question. In the current release of web services, what does SOAP, S-O-A-P, stand for? Okay, well, the answer to both trick questions is the same. They don't stand for anything. So in the current release of web services, SOAP is no longer an acronym because it was a misleading. It used to stand for Simple Object Access Protocol. That was a misleading acronym, so they de-acronymified it. And so in the current release of web services, SOAP doesn't stand for anything. It's the protocol used to send data. It's not an acronym anymore. Ajax, you shouldn't treat it as an acronym. Write it with a capital A, lowercase j-a-x, because the original acronym, asynchronous JavaScript and XML, is misleading because it's not usually XML. It doesn't even have to be asynchronous. It's usually asynchronous. The J is the only part of the acronym that's really right. You have to use JavaScript. But rarely, no, I shouldn't say rarely, but way less than 50% of the time in real applications do you use XML as the protocol. And so in this example, what I'm getting back from this URL is a chunk of HTML. I'm getting a chunk of HTML back, and I'm just sticking it into the page. So this is perhaps Ajah, A-J-A-H, asynchronous JavaScript and HTML. And there's also asynchronous JavaScript and JSON, Ajax, and many other formats as well. So don't treat Ajax as an acronym. Just treat it as the way you use JavaScript to get data from the server and put it into the page asynchronously. OK, so go to the server, go to this URL. This is a relative URL. One more question. Why in Ajax do you have to connect back to the same server that the HTML page came from? It has something to do with security, but specifically what kind of security? Why do browsers only let JavaScript connect back to the machine they came from? Cross-site scripting is an issue, but that's not nearly the most important issue. That's not the fundamental reason why browsers enforce this restriction. And there's an even more important reason than that. It's firewall security. The most important, the fundamental basic reason why browsers only let you make a JavaScript request back to the machine you came from is so that you don't break firewall security. Because this code is running on the end user's machine. So you're sitting at your company inside of your corporate firewall. If JavaScript could make a random connection to any public address, you bring in this JavaScript code into your web page, and it could make a connection, if this same site restriction wasn't enforced, to a URL that's inside your corporate firewall. It could read that data, and it could ship it back out. And so if JavaScript could make connections to arbitrary URLs, you would break firewall security, and then everybody would ban it, and it wouldn't do any good. So you can only connect back to the machine you came from. If it wants to go to another site, then it can do it and pass it through in 2 steps. But the server is outside your corporate firewall, so it can't access proprietary information inside your firewall. So this has to be a relative URL. So one more time. Connect to this address, send this query data, take the data that comes back, in this case it's an HTML, and stick it in the page in the place that has this ID. And the place that has this ID is this div right here. OK, and then the server-side code I'm not going to go through, but in this case I'm doing it in Java. But there's nothing in the jQuery code that knows it's in Java. It just says, here's the URL, here's the query data, here's where I'm going to put the results. And in this case, I've got some Java EE logic that reads a customer ID and looks up some information and sends some results back. OK, so if I want to try this out, if I enter A1, 2, 3, 4, notice it updates it inside the current page. It doesn't produce a new page. I get something. James Gosling, the father of Java. Jesse James Garrett, not the father of Ajax, but the person who wrote the paper that coined the acronym Ajax. Google was actually using Ajax before Jesse James Garrett even wrote this paper. And A1, 2, 3, 6, 8. Illegal result. OK, so that's category number 1. Category number 1 is you've already got a web application. You wrote it in PHP, you wrote it in .NET, you wrote it in Java, but you want to Ajaxify it. Grab a good JavaScript library. And what's the definition of a good depends a lot on your application. I'll talk more about that this afternoon. Situation number 2 is you're starting from scratch. You don't already have an application. You're starting a new project, and you want to integrate Ajax in from the very beginning. In a situation like that, you can do better than one of the JavaScript libraries. Because the JavaScript libraries are relatively low level. But there's a number of libraries that have integrated Ajax support where you don't have to do the explicit JavaScript programming. And if you're a Java developer, the prime examples of those are version 2 of JSF. If you're familiar with Java server faces, version 1 was kind of, I guess it was okay, but most people weren't too excited about it. It was pushed by IBM and by Oracle and by the big people, but I wasn't too thrilled with JSF 1. But version 2 really learned the lessons of Ruby on Rails, really took the feedback from the user community, and version 2 of JSF is really great. I like it a lot. Same with Struts 2 or Spring MVC 3. All of those have integrated Ajax support. And if you're in the .NET world, ASP.NET Ajax is the same thing. Rather than building a vanilla ASP.NET application and adding in jQuery, you use their integrated support. Okay, so let me give an example of doing that in JSF. And I want to do the same sort of idea. I want to enter a customer ID, enter a password, send it to the server, and either get back the first name, last name, and bank account balance of the customer with that ID or an error message. And let me give you a quick summary of how JSF works. So ignore the part in red for a second. If I ignore the part in red and I just look at this little part here that says H:command button, that's non-Ajaxified JSF. And it says, when the user presses this push button, go to the server, submit all the forms, and send them into Java Beans. Then run this method. And then normally in JSF, you have some page navigation rules that, depending on what this method returns, decides what the results page is. But then you take that and you just add in this little tag in the middle. Notice I haven't written any JavaScript. I haven't even loaded any JavaScript. And now this says, oh, magically turn this into an Ajax request. And now when the user presses the push button, it still submits the form behind the scenes. It still takes all the text fields and push buttons and checkboxes and populates them into beans. It still calls this method, but it doesn't navigate to a new page. Now it calls this method, and then it figures out what information do you need to send back to rebuild the HTML element or the JSF element that has this ID. And this ID says, print out the message. So technically this is the Java function called getMessage. And so it figures out what it needs to send back to re-display this piece. So now when I press this push button, instead of submitting a form and going to a new page, just by adding in this tag, that's all you had to do to totally change the functionality, now it's an Ajax request. And it goes to the server, does all the stuff it normally does, and then it reprints this message. Second here, restart. And here's why this is better than jQuery. So there's two reasons. One, this is integrated with your existing business logic. So all the beans and the classes and the information you already have in JSF, this knows about it. Or if I add in jQuery here, I'd have to kind of do something entirely separate. And secondly, I didn't have to write any JavaScript. I just put a tag that says, oh, now turn this magically into a JavaScript request. So it's a lot higher level, and this is a better approach when you're starting a new project. Now, it does have some limitations. For instance, if they didn't think of what you wanted with this tag, it has a lot of options, then you have to write a lot of JavaScript yourself, which is kind of low level. But for most of the situations, this is much higher level, much easier to integrate with your existing logic. But it's no good if you don't already have this. So this is good if you're starting a new project from scratch. OK, and of course, this is a little bit of a joke, because of course, this page is not blank at all. And in fact, the proof that this page is not blank is this statement here. It's a little geek humor here. OK, and obviously, there really is JavaScript. is just the end user never, the programmer never saw it and the programmer never wrote it. Okay, and then I have a very, very simple Java behind the scenes. So if you look at this example, the JavaScript is ridiculously simpler, or you didn't write any. And the Java is dramatically simpler. Notice this is just a plain old ordinary Java object that just computes a message and computes a balance. I don't have to write a servlet, and I'm not reading query parameters, and I'm not decoding anything. Okay, so situation number one is you have a web application already. You want to add in Ajax functionality. Don't write it from scratch in JavaScript. Grab one of the good libraries, and there's lots of good libraries out there that do Ajax for you and that add in richer GUI controls. jQuery, Prototype, Scriptaculous, Dojo, EXTJS, MooTools, YUI, and a bunch of others. The third category is you want to make a really hardcore Ajax application that looks like a desktop application, kind of like Yahoo Mail or Gmail. You hardly have any page navigation at all. Or the second category is a hybrid. It's kind of like the Google homepage. When you type something into the Google homepage, it does Ajax. But when you press submit, it does a traditional web application. So it's a mixture. Sometimes you don't want a mixture. You want something that's just pure Ajax from beginning to end, kind of like the Gmail or Yahoo Mail pages. And you're starting from scratch. In a case like that, there's a third alternative, the Google Web Toolkit. And the Google Web Toolkit is all about trying to make it look like a desktop application. Yes, you're running in the browser. No, you don't need any special plugins. So it's not like Flash, or it's not using Java on the client. And it does a lot of very interesting things, and I've got a talk on GWT coming up. But the really cool thing about GWT is you use Java everywhere. You use Java on the server, and you use Java on the client. And as I'll talk about tomorrow, well, if you have to use Java on the client, then it's not Ajax. But they have a compiler that turns all the Java that you write for the client side into JavaScript. So at runtime, Java is gone on the client. But you write everything in Java, and you've got strong typing, and you've got the support that your IDE like Eclipse gives you. You've got your integrated debuggers. And you can share your data structures back and forth between the client and the server, which you can't do with either of the previous two examples. You can actually send Java classes. This is not like JSON snapshots, which just send the state. This sends the whole entire class, including the behavior. Okay, we'll talk more about GWT tomorrow, but just to kind of give you a quick preview here, I want to do the same thing. I want a banking application. I want to type in a first name and last name, and type in a username and password, or a bank ID and a password, and I want to get back the first name, last name, and bank account balance. And the key point is everything is in Java. You write it as if you were doing Swing or SWT or the AWT, which not everybody thinks is a good thing, but you may. And you don't have to do anything with HTTP. You're not reading query data. You're not URL decoding things. And you don't have to build HTML on the server. OK, so I have a customer object. In order to send it back and forth across the network, I make it serializable. That's just Java magic that says that there is a binary form of this class. And Java programmers are not impressed by this. They say, well, serializable has been around in Java for ages. What's the big deal? Except that at runtime, it's getting sent to a browser that's only running JavaScript. And so not only did Google, I shouldn't say Google, the GWT development team, this is purely open source, you're not tied in any way to Google whatsoever if you use GWT, not only did they write a compiler that takes Java and turns it into JavaScript, which is a very cool idea, but they also re-implemented the serialization API in JavaScript. And boy, am I glad I'm not the poor programmer who had to do that. So you write something that looks like an ordinary class to represent a piece of data in Java. Then I write some client-side code. And if you're not a Java programmer, you won't know exactly what this means. But it basically says that when the user presses a push button, it's going to call this method. And this method is going to say, go to this text field and look up the text, and then send it to the server. And when the result comes back from the server, pass the result to this guy. And this looks very similar to how you'd write this in desktop Java programming. But the point is, behind the scenes, this all gets compiled to JavaScript because it's running in the browser. And this is the code that this is this code right here. So when the result sometime later in the future comes back from the server, it gets passed to this method. And notice that what I'm passing to this method is a high-level Java data structure, a regular class. You can't do that with jQuery. You can't do that with Prototype. You can't do that with ext.js. You can't even do that with the integrated libraries like JSF and Struts 2 and ASP.NET Ajax. So this is a very cool idea. So you're sending very complicated data back and forth across the network, but with very simple syntax. Okay, and then I've got some server-side code, and so this is just some logic to find the information on the server. You didn't write any JavaScript. At runtime, there's tons of JavaScript. All the client-side code is JavaScript at runtime, but you didn't write any of it. And you get the same kind of functionality. But the big difference with GWT versus JSF2 or Struts 2 or Spring MVC or ASP.NET Ajax is it's the same URL the whole time. You're not doing page navigation. Whereas the other approach is it's a hybrid. You do some page navigation and some Ajax. This is Ajax from beginning to end. All about Ajax. Make it look like a desktop application. This URL at the top never even changes. So, the first question is, do you really want a web application? Please, don't do a web application if a regular program is good enough. If it's going to be the same 10 users at the same 10 computers in the same 10 offices accessing your application, don't do a web application. And web applications, no matter how much you spruce them up, will never be as good as a real program. So if you want to do World of Warcraft, you can't do it with Ajax. It just will never be rich enough. You'll just never have a good enough user interface. It'll never be good enough to satisfy the end users. So it's a compromise. You want universal access. You want somebody to be able to walk up to any computer anywhere and be able to, that's on your network and be able to access your application. But then you say, well, okay, I need a web-based application, but a traditional web-based application is not good enough for my requirements. The idea of pressing a button, waiting for an entire page to come back, can't do anything in the meantime, the limited amount of GUI controls that regular HTML has is not good enough, so I need to spruce it up with richer controls, and I want to make it fine-grained updates and asynchronous. So I want Ajax. All right, fine. Which approach do I use? Well, it depends on the situation. So if you already have an app, it's already doing regular page navigation, but you want to add in some richer controls or some Ajax functionality to an application that already exists, then grab a JavaScript library. And which one you grab? ext.js, Prototype, Scriptaculous, jQuery, YUI, Dojo, and a raft of others is a difficult question. I'll talk some about it this afternoon, but I won't give you a clear, cut-and-dried answer. It's a hard question. But often you're starting a new project. And if you're starting a new project, you can do a lot better than that. Because when you use jQuery or Prototype or Scriptaculous or whatever, they're not integrated with your server-side business logic. And they require you to write both the server-side code and JavaScript separately. Whereas Struts 2, JSF 2, Spring MVC 3, ASP.NET Ajax, they're kind of integrated. And so you just put little tags into your pages that tell it to do Ajax. You're not writing the JavaScript yourself. And then those Ajax calls know about all of your server-side. In the case of Java, you call them the server-side beans, your business logic beans. And the names of your beans and methods are known to the Ajax code. So it's a lot more powerful, it's a lot simpler. And it's really based on when you're doing a hybrid application, where you're doing some form submissions, kind of like the Google homepage or hotels.com, and some Ajax support. Sometimes you really want to go hardcore. You don't want to do any form submission. You don't want to do any page navigation. You want it to look like a desktop application, but still be Ajax at heart. In other words, CSS, JavaScript, and HTML only. No plugins required, no downloads required, access from any random computer anywhere. Google Wave, by the way, is built out of GWT. In that case, you have a third option. Okay, I'm just about done, and I'll take a couple of questions. But I do have one story that I was reading in the paper that it kind of illustrates this. So, Flash developers look at this talk, and they just burst out laughing. They say, Marty, this is ridiculously complicated. first of all, you have 3 different categories of options. And inside of each of at least the first 2 categories, you have about 20 choices. And then you got to choose, which editor development environment you use and what code you run on the server. And, this is so complicated. With Flash, it's so much simpler. And that's true, it is simpler, but it's not the same category. It's not what you can do in a browser with what everybody has installed already. So there was, I was reading in the paper this morning in my hotel, there were a bunch of mountain climbers up in North India last week, and they were scaling one of the smaller peaks. And it was, it's getting kind of warm now, and so the snowpack was kind of melting, and so they were halfway up the glacier when the snow slides out from underneath them, and they're all left hanging by a rope. And they look around quickly, and they realize that there are 21 of them hanging from the rope. And the specs for the rope say that it can hold 20 people. And so either one person lets go or everybody's going to die. And it turns out, up in North India the previous week, there had been an Adobe Developers Conference. So it turns out that 20 of the people dangling from this rope over the precipice are Flash developers. And one of them is an Ajax developer. So the Flash developers say, well, this is not a difficult situation. Let go of the rope, buddy. And the Ajax developer is madly trying to think of how to save his life. And so he says, well, Ajax is really complicated compared to Flash. It's a big pain in the neck. It's harder work than Flash. You have a lot more choices of options over here than Flash. And so you spend half your time deciding even which toolkit you want. And it is a lot more work. But, the one Ajax developer on the dangling from the rope says, the real world is messy. And often what fits end users' requirements better requires messy solutions. So, says the one Ajax developer dangling from this rope, based on this philosophy of what's good for the end user, I'm happy to sacrifice myself for the good of the rest of you. And based on this stirring speech, the 20 Flash developers burst into applause. OK, that's all I have. I've got a couple minutes for questions, but there's not another talk in here for a little while, so I can take a few other questions after that. But I can take one or two now.
You touched upon the JavaScript aspects of these three scenarios, but can you also touch upon the asynchronous? Can you also touch upon the asynchronous support in these three scenarios?
OK, so the question was, I talked a little bit about the kind of JavaScript you'd have to write in each of these 3 cases. But what about the support it has for asynchronous updates or asynchronicity in all 3 cases? All 3 cases give you equal asynchronous updates. So in all 3 cases, so with jQuery, YUI, Prototype, Scriptaculous, they fully support asynchronous updates where you insert into the page, the person can work in the meantime. So does Jsf 2, ASP.NET, Ajax, Struts 2, and so on, and so does GWT. So in the terms of the support they give you for asynchronous asynchronicity, I think they're about the same.
Does it support pub/sub model, or does the client have to kind of keep polling the server for event changes?
Oh, OK. So a separate question is, so in the examples I gave, the user initiated an action, press a push button, right there just like the Google homepage. The user typed a key. Right there at the time, it goes to the server, it retrieves some data, but it's asynchronous. So if you press another button in the meantime, then another request can be firing off, and when the first one comes back, it comes in. The second one comes back, it comes in, and you can work in the meantime. But there's also a category of applications where you want to kind of automatically get updates. So like in Gmail, and sometimes they call this Comet or reverse Ajax, where you want to kind of do a server push, and it's polling behind the scenes. And then that kind of application is more difficult.
We are using JBoss theme. Hello.
OK.
And
in fact, JSF 2
yeah.
is very directly built on JBoss theme.
Yeah. And we have situations in our project wherein we re-render a component, and then it doesn't work just as well. And then we have to re-render the whole page. So when we have issues with a framework, it's really hard to debug it unless the next version comes up. So what's your take on this?
OK, I don't know the specific examples. I don't use JBoss theme. But I think this is a good point about a deficiency in the middle approach. So the advantage of the middle approach is it's simpler coding for the developer and is integrated with your server-side business logic. But the disadvantage is you're counting on the framework to get it right for you. So first of all, if the framework doesn't build in the functionality you want, oh, you want to have some sort of special drop-down box that does something, oh, they didn't build it in, then you got to write it yourself, and then it's even harder than the first approach. And secondly, if there's a bug, if they don't do it right, then you're kind of stuck. Whereas in the first approach, you're writing all that code yourself, and you have full control, and if you don't get it right, it's your fault, not somebody else's fault. So yeah, I think that is another disadvantage of the middle approach. Okay, I think it's about 10:15, so I'll stop here, but I'll hang around in the front for a while, so if you have other questions, I'll be happy to entertain them then. Thanks very much for having me.